They laughed so loud I thought the floor might crack beneath us. "Look at Grandma trying to dance!" My granddaughter's voice rang out clear and sharp, slicing through the gentle hum of the community hall like a broken record skipping on a cruel refrain. Her friends echoed her laughter, their faces twisting into amused sneers as if I were a spectacle, some relic from a time they were glad to leave behind, a forgotten character in their bright, buzzing world. The limp, that stubborn unevenness in my step that I had learned to live with decades ago after my hip injury, became the centerpiece of their mockery. The hall felt colder then, the light harsher, even though the overhead fluorescents hummed their usual indifferent tune. The music played on, but for me, the melody blurred into the background noise of humiliation. I am 81 years old, and this dance, this annual harvest ball at the local community center, is one of the few events I still look forward to. It's a place where I once felt alive, a place where I could still remember myself before the years piled on, before family dinners became exercises in invisibility, and the rooms I once filled with laughter grew silent. I live now in a small apartment in a senior complex, where the walls wear the faded pastel of forgotten stories, and the air carries the muted rhythm of early bingo nights and the faint scent of linoleum wax. But tonight the room seemed vast and unwelcoming, a stage set for a scene I never auditioned for. The dance floor was bright with swirling lights and reflections, a kaleidoscope of colors dancing on the polished wood. I had come wearing my best dress, the one I bought last spring, a soft blue that always made me think of quiet mornings by the sea. My shoes were a little tight, but I had managed the walk here carefully, each step measured and deliberate to avoid the sharp twinges from my hip. The small limp I carry is not a flaw, but a story, a mark of survival from years of life lived hard and full. Yet tonight, that story was twisted into a punchline. I remembered how, years ago, my late husband and I used to dance right here, under these very lights, when the world still seemed big and full of promise. He told me once that I moved like I owned the room, like I was born to fill the space with my presence. I laughed then, flushed with love and youth, but tonight, my granddaughter's laughter washed that memory away like a cruel tide. The girl who once sat on my lap, who listened wide-eyed to my stories of distant places and bold adventures, now turned me into a character for her amusement, her friends egging her on with cruel smiles and whispered jokes. The sting of betrayal was sharp, slicing deeper than any physical pain I felt from my limp. No one stopped her, not even her mother, my daughter, who watched from a distance with an awkward smile and averted eyes, as if discomfort could erase what had just been done. The room filled with chatter, music, and the shuffle of feet, but I felt only the heavy weight of isolation pressing in. I sat down at the edge of the dance floor, clutching my purse in my lap, pretending not to hear the whispered giggles and pointed glances. My heart clenched, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to stay grounded in the moment and not dissolve into tears. The family that once begged me to babysit, to hold the grandkids close when they were small and frightened, now barely greeted me. Their warmth was gone, replaced by polite distance and the unspoken message that I no longer belonged to the picture they were painting. At the dinner table later, I was handed a paper plate, while others used fine china. My granddaughter sat nearby, absorbed in her phone, occasionally glancing up to share another laugh with her friends. Again, carefully excluding me from their circle, their lives, their fun. I thought about the years when I was the one who taught that granddaughter how to walk, how to say her first words, how to hold a pencil. The years when I made her birthday cakes with hands that now trembled slightly as I tried to pour the punch. The years I gave her a place to belong. And now, in this crowded room full of familiar faces, I was nothing more than an afterthought, a joke, a shadow of the grandmother I had once been. The music changed then to a slower tune, the kind that invites you to take a partner. I watched couples sway and spin, young and old, but no one asked me. The sting of being forgotten was almost unbearable. But within that silence, a small ember flickered inside me, a reminder that I still had a heartbeat, that I still had a voice, even if it was barely a whisper. As the evening wore on, I sat quietly, nursing my pride and my pain, surrounded by laughter that wasn't for me. The night was long, the lights dimming and brightening in a slow, cruel dance of their own. When at last the music slowed and the crowd thinned, I found myself standing, slowly rising on legs that ached but would not betray me completely. It was time to choose, whether to remain on the sidelines, invisible and dismissed, or to reclaim the dignity that laughter tried to steal. I walked out onto the dance floor, every eye turning toward me. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to taste. My granddaughter's friends smirked, ready for another show. But I did not come for their approval. I came for myself. I approached the young man who had been circling the dance floor, the boyfriend of one of those girls, the one who had been watching me with a mixture of curiosity and unease. I held out my hand and said, "Dance with me, unless you're too afraid." His surprise was clear, but he took my hand without hesitation. We moved slowly, deliberately, finding a rhythm that was mine and mine alone. For a moment, the room stopped being a place of humiliation and became a space of quiet triumph. The limp did not vanish, but it no longer defined me. I was more than a shadow, more than a punchline. I was still a woman who could move, who could choose, who could dance, and as the music played, I understood something new. Dignity isn't given, it's taken. Even if you have to walk with a limp. The moment I realized everything had shifted irreversibly came just seconds after her laughter echoed through the room, a sharp, careless sound that seemed to ricochet off the walls and settle deep inside me like a stone dropped into still water. It was not just the mockery itself, though that cut deeply enough, but the way she said it, the cruel joy in her voice, the deliberate performance for her friends, as if she were unveiling some great spectacle that everyone was meant to witness and enjoy at my expense. "Look at Grandma trying to dance," she said, her words ringing clear and loud, her friends' laughter rising in waves around us. I could see the way their eyes gleamed with amusement, how they nudged each other with sly smiles, as if I were no more than a source of entertainment, a punchline in a joke they had crafted without me. I watched my granddaughter's face, the familiar features twisted into something I barely recognized, a mask of youthful arrogance and thoughtless cruelty that made my chest ache. She was not just being childish, she was being deliberately cruel. It was the kind of cruelty that comes from feeling powerful at another's expense, from knowing that you hold the microphone in a room where someone else is forced to listen. My granddaughter, once a small girl with wide eyes and a gentle smile who clung to my hand when the world felt too big, had transformed into a person who found joy in diminishing me, in exposing my vulnerabilities for others to laugh at. And worse, no one stopped her. Her mother, my own daughter, stood nearby, her lips pressed tight, her eyes flicking away like a guilty spectator hoping the moment would pass without confrontation. I sat frozen at the edge of the dance floor, the weight of every mocking glance pressing down on my shoulders, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the edge of my purse. I could hear the music playing, the melodies I once knew so well blending into the background noise of humiliation. The hall around me seemed to shrink, the faces blurring into a sea of judgment and dismissal. It was as if I had become invisible, a ghost haunting a celebration that no longer had room for me. I felt the sting of betrayal, sharper than any physical pain I had endured over the years, sharper even than the ache in my hip that caused the limp they mocked. This was a wound deeper than flesh, a wound carved out by the ones I loved most. The catalyst, the spark that ignited a slow-burning fire within me, was not just the public humiliation, but the cruel acceptance of it by those who should have protected me. The family who once welcomed me with open arms, who cherished the stories I told and the warmth I brought to their lives, had quietly rewritten the script. In their new version, I was no longer a beloved grandmother. I was a source of embarrassment, an inconvenience to be ignored or dismissed. The laughter that echoed across the room was not just hers. It was a chorus of unspoken agreements, of silent nods that said, "She doesn't belong here anymore." I was being exiled, not with harsh words or angry outbursts, but with a quiet, devastating erasure. As the laughter died down and the music shifted to a slower tune, I felt the full weight of my solitude. My granddaughter's friends turned their attention back to their own conversations and dances, leaving me in a bubble of silence and exclusion. Even the staff at the community center seemed to avert their eyes, unwilling or unsure how to intervene in a moment that was clearly charged but left no room for challenge. I felt the cold sting of tears threatening to spill over, but I held them back, refusing to give my tormentors the satisfaction of seeing me break. That night, as I sat alone in my small apartment, the events replayed in my mind like a broken film strip, each frame a reminder of my diminished place in a family and community that once embraced me. The catalyst was not a single act, but a convergence of subtle betrayals. The jokes whispered behind my back, the avoidance of eye contact, the gentle but firm exclusion from conversations and plans. The mocking of my limp was merely the loudest expression of a truth I had known for a long time, that I was being pushed to the margins, a woman whose body and spirit no longer fit into the image her family wanted to present to the world. Yet within that night of despair, a seed of resolve took root. I realized that this moment of betrayal, as painful as it was, could also be a turning point. It forced me to confront the reality of my situation, to see clearly the gulf that had grown between me and the people I had loved and trusted. But it also made me ask a question I had been too afraid to voice. What if I stopped waiting for their acceptance? What if I stopped shrinking myself to fit into the roles they assigned me? That question lingered in the quiet darkness, a fragile flicker of hope against the shadows of rejection. The catalyst, then, was both an end and a beginning. It marked the moment I stopped pretending that everything was fine, the moment I stopped excusing their cruelty with excuses about youth or ignorance. It was the moment I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my pain without apology. But it was also the moment I began to imagine a different path, a path where I might reclaim my dignity, my voice, and my right to be seen as a whole person, not a caricature. In the days that followed, the sting of that night remained, but it no longer paralyzed me. Instead, it became a quiet fuel, a steady fire burning beneath the surface, urging me to stand taller, to walk with intention, and to take up space unapologetically. The laughter that had once threatened to drown me now seemed distant, like a storm passing over a landscape that would soon feel the sun again. The catalyst was painful, but it was necessary. It was the first step on a long journey toward reclaiming myself. In the days and weeks that followed the night of the harvest ball, I found myself caught in a slow, steady unraveling of the life I thought I knew. The catalyst had been sharp, immediate, a wound freshly opened, but what came next was a quieter, more insidious kind of pain, the kind that seeps in unnoticed until it becomes part of the landscape. The first escalation was not a dramatic confrontation or an explosive argument. It was a subtle erosion, a fading away that no one acknowledged, but everyone understood. My place in the family, once secure and cherished, began to shrink inch by inch, like the fading light at dusk, until I was left on the edges, watching from the sidelines. The morning after the ball, I woke with a heavy heart and a limp that felt more pronounced, as if my body carried the weight of the humiliation as well as the years. I moved slowly through my small apartment, the worn carpet soft beneath my feet, but unable to cushion the ache in my chest. The phone sat silent on the table. No messages, no calls. It was as if the world had taken a collective breath and held it, waiting to see what I would do next. I knew then that the laughter was not an isolated moment. It was a signal, a line crossed, and that nothing would be quite the same again. My granddaughter, once a source of joy and connection, began to avoid me. When I called to check in, my voice met with brief replies, or more often, a polite excuse that ended the conversation quickly. The warmth that had once existed in our relationship was replaced by a distance so vast it felt like a chasm. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming, and when I visited the house, I was met with quiet rooms and conversations that paused when I entered, as if my presence was an interruption to be tolerated rather than welcomed. At the community center, the place that had once been a refuge for me, I found myself increasingly invisible. The harvest ball was over, but other events and socials continued, and each time I went I was met with polite nods or hurried greetings from faces that once smiled warmly. The women who had once shared stories and dances with me now glanced away, or spoke in hushed tones, their eyes avoiding mine. The laughter that had erupted around my granddaughter's mockery seemed to linger in the air, a ghost that haunted every gathering. Even within my own family, the changes were palpable. My daughter, who had once confided in me and sought my advice, now kept her distance, her phone always close and her schedule perpetually full. My son's visits became rarer and shorter, often interrupted by calls or texts, leaving me feeling like a background character in the story of their lives. The grandchildren, once eager for my attention and affection, now treated me with a curious blend of politeness and discomfort, unsure how to navigate the new dynamics that had settled like dust between us. The physical reminders of my age and injury became sharper as well. The limp, once a quiet companion, now felt like a spotlight on my vulnerability. I noticed the way people glanced at my gait, the way some tried to hide their looks behind forced smiles. The ache in my hip was a constant, whispering reminder of the limitations creeping into my days. I tried to ignore it, to carry on as I always had, but the body remembers what the heart tries to forget. The mirror reflected a woman who was still here, still breathing, but whose reflection seemed smaller, more fragile, edged with the quiet sadness of exclusion. One afternoon, I found myself at the local grocery store, pushing a cart slowly down the aisles, when I overheard a group of teenagers whispering nearby. "That's the grandma who can barely walk," one said, his voice tinged with mockery, but not loud enough for me to respond. Their laughter was soft but cutting, a reminder that the world beyond family and community center could be just as unforgiving. I didn't turn to confront them. Instead, I walked out of the store feeling more alone than ever. At home, the silence grew heavier. The phone remained mostly quiet, and the letters I sent went unanswered or were met with brief replies that felt like closing doors. The pictures on the walls, once vibrant with memories, seemed to fade into shadows. I started spending more time sitting by the window, watching the world move on without me. The neighborhood children played in the street, their laughter distant and unreachable. I longed to join them, to be part of their energy and light, but my feet carried me only so far. One evening, I attended a small gathering at the senior center, hoping to find solace in the company of the others my age. The room was filled with familiar faces, some kind and welcoming, others distant and preoccupied. I joined a conversation about old movies and gardening, trying to focus on the stories that once brought me joy. But beneath the surface, I felt the persistent undercurrent of exclusion, the quiet realization that even here, I was becoming a peripheral figure. The loneliness was a quiet storm, brewing beneath polite smiles and gentle nods. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice changes in myself as well. The confidence I once carried with me, however modest, started to waver. I found myself hesitating before speaking, wondering if my words would be heard or dismissed. I withdrew from invitations, fearing the stinging sting of judgment or pity. The warmth in my heart grew cold, replaced by a cautious reserve that shielded me from further pain but also kept me isolated. Yet even in the midst of this slow erosion, a quiet strength began to grow. I realized that if I was to survive this new reality, I would have to find ways to rebuild myself from the fragments left behind. I started to walk a little farther each day, forcing my legs to carry me beyond the familiar corners of my neighborhood. I revisited old hobbies: reading, knitting, tending to the small garden on my balcony. These small acts of self-care became lifelines, threads weaving me back together when the world seemed determined to unravel me. One afternoon, while attending a community art class, I met a woman named Ellen, a widow with a gentle smile and a sharp wit. She didn't know my story, nor did I share it at first, but her presence was a balm to the quiet ache inside me. We talked about everything and nothing, about paintings and poetry, about the small rebellions that kept us going. Ellen reminded me that even when the world tries to write us out of the story, we still have the power to turn the page. It was during this time that I began to understand the true nature of the first escalation, not as a breaking point, but as a call to resilience. The slow fading of my place in family and community was painful, but it was also a clearing. It created space for new connections, new ways of seeing myself beyond the roles I had inhabited for so long. The limp was still there. The ache still whispered its warnings, but my spirit stirred with the possibility of reclaiming life on my own terms. The first escalation taught me that invisibility can be a kind of imprisonment, but also that even in the quietest shadows, there is light to be found. It was a lesson in endurance and self-compassion, in learning to walk again, not just with my legs, but with my heart open to the future. The days grew longer, the seasons shifted, and with each step, however faltering, I moved toward a horizon that promised more than mere survival. It promised a life still worth dancing for. That night, when the world finally quieted and the house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, I found myself staring out the window at the soft glow of streetlights flickering against the dark sky. The memory of the harvest ball, the laughter, and the sting of humiliation still clung to me like a shadow. But something else had begun to take root. A subtle, stubborn flicker of something I had nearly forgotten: hope. It was not a sudden epiphany or a grand moment of revelation, but rather a quiet turning inward, a moment where the weight of rejection shifted enough to reveal a crack through which a new light could enter. As I sat alone in the stillness, I thought back to a night many decades earlier, a night of music and movement that had left an imprint on my soul far deeper than I had ever realized until now. It was the year 1959, and I was young and fearless, full of dreams that stretched beyond the horizon of my small town. My late husband had taken me to a dance not unlike the one I had just left, the same kind of community gathering filled with familiar faces and hopeful hearts. I remembered how he had looked at me then, eyes bright and full of love, telling me I moved like I owned the room, like the whole world belonged to us in that moment. The memory was vivid: the feel of his hand in mine, the swirl of my dress, the music weaving around us like a promise. That memory was a lifeline, a bridge connecting the woman I had been to the woman I still was beneath the years and the pain. I realized that the limp I carried was not a symbol of weakness, but a testament to resilience. It was a map of battles fought and survived, a reminder that I had stood tall even when the world tried to knock me down. The laughter of my granddaughter and her friends, painful as it was, could not erase the strength etched into every step I took. This was my body, my history, and my story, and it was mine to own. With this quiet resolve stirring within me, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I would return to the dance hall, not to seek approval or to mend broken relationships, but to reclaim the part of myself that had been silenced. I wanted to remind the world, and most importantly myself, that I was still here, still capable of joy and presence. The act was simple, yet profound. I would walk onto that dance floor and take the first step toward owning my dignity again, no matter the cost. The next evening, I dressed carefully, choosing a soft dress that made me feel like myself again, a nod to the woman who had once danced freely without fear. My steps were slow but deliberate as I made my way back to the community center, each movement a quiet declaration of defiance against the erasure I had endured. The familiar faces turned toward me with surprise, some with awkward smiles, others with thinly veiled curiosity. The room held its breath, as if sensing the shift that was about to unfold. I did not seek out my granddaughter or her friends. Instead, I moved with purpose toward the edge of the dance floor, letting the music wash over me like a balm. The melodies were older now, tunes I recognized from long ago, and with each note, I felt a connection to the past and a renewal of the present. The memory of that night in 1959 lingered in my mind, a beacon guiding me back to a place where I belonged. Not because others granted me permission, but because I claimed it for myself. As I stood there, a woman from the audience caught my eye. A kind stranger with a knowing smile and a gentle nod. She whispered across the room, "I remember you. You danced like no one else." Her words were a balm to my wounded spirit, a quiet reminder that even when the world seems to forget, there are always those who see. That small gesture, simple and unassuming, filled me with a strength I had not realized I still possessed. The music slowed, and without hesitation, I extended my hand toward a young man who had been watching the floor with an air of quiet uncertainty. He was the boyfriend of one of the girls who had mocked me, a fact that made my invitation all the more powerful. His eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face, but he accepted without a word. We began to move together, slowly finding a rhythm that was mine alone. The limp remained, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it became part of the dance, a signature of my persistence and grace. As we moved across the floor, I noticed the room's atmosphere shift. The laughter faded, replaced by a hush of respect and awe. Eyes that had once been filled with mockery now held something closer to admiration. For a brief moment, the dance floor became a stage where I could reclaim not just my steps, but my story. The young man's gentle presence was a reminder that dignity can be shared and that courage is contagious. When the music ended, I kissed the young man's cheek, a small deliberate act that sealed the moment, and walked off the floor without looking back. I did not need to see the faces behind me to know that something had changed. In that dance, I had taken back a piece of myself, one step at a time. That night, as I lay in bed, the ache in my hip was still there, but it was softened by a sense of renewal. I understood that the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more moments of pain, more battles with loneliness and rejection. But the midpoint had come, a turning away from silence and invisibility toward a quiet, unyielding assertion of self. I was not just a grandmother to be mocked or ignored. I was a woman who still had stories to tell, steps to dance, and a life to live. This shift was not about revenge or confrontation. It was about reclaiming my right to exist fully and unapologetically. It was about understanding that dignity is not granted by others, but built from within, one deliberate choice at a time. The dance floor was no longer a place of fear or humiliation, but a space of possibility and power. And so, with the memory of that dance burning softly in my heart, I embraced the path ahead. It was a path of resilience and quiet rebellion, of finding joy where it had been hidden, and of learning to walk and sometimes dance on my own terms once more. The days that followed my return to the dance floor brought with them a turbulent mix of hope and hardship, a second escalation in the quiet war that was unfolding in the spaces I once called home. That moment of reclaiming dignity had been a powerful spark, a defiant act that echoed louder than I expected. But the world rarely changes overnight, and those who had once whispered behind my back now raised their voices in subtle but unmistakable opposition. The laughter and mockery had not disappeared. They had merely shifted, transforming into something more complex and harder to confront. It began slowly, with whispers and sidelong glances at family gatherings, where I was no longer the center, but an edge, an inconvenience tolerated with thin smiles. My granddaughter's friends, emboldened perhaps by my courage or simply by the cruelty of youth, resumed their teasing, their words edged with sarcasm and cold amusement. But now they were not alone. The echoes of their mockery found reinforcement in unexpected places, among relatives who once claimed to care, in conversations that skirted around me like a shadow, in the subtle exclusions that accumulated like dust in the corners of my life. At the next family reunion, held in a sunlit backyard that once seemed to bloom with love and laughter, I was greeted with polite nods and distant smiles. My granddaughter, seated among her friends, cast me a glance that was sharp and dismissive, as if I were a relic best forgotten. The teasing resumed, quieter but no less cutting, a whispered joke about my slow walk, a shared glance that made me the subject without the need for words. I felt the sting not just in the laughter, but in the silence of those who might have stood with me, but chose instead to turn away. The worst came unexpectedly. During the afternoon, as children played and adults mingled, my granddaughter's boyfriend approached, a young man with a charm that had once seemed harmless. He smiled politely, but with a tension I hadn't noticed before. When he asked me to dance, the invitation sounded more like a test than a gesture of kindness. As we moved awkwardly across the grass, I caught a glimpse of the circle of girls watching, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief. One whispered to another, "She's really doing it." Their eyes glinted with a cruel delight, as if my very presence challenged some unspoken rule. It was in that moment I understood that my small victory on the dance floor was not just a challenge to my granddaughter, but to the entire social order that had quietly decided I no longer belonged. The dance was no longer just about reclaiming my dignity. It had become a battleground where the past and present collided. The young man, torn between respect and peer pressure, faltered, his steps uneven like mine. I led gently, each movement a statement of resilience and quiet strength. The girls' laughter dissolved into silence as the dance ended, but the tension lingered, a reminder that acceptance was still far away. At home, the pressure continued to mount. Conversations grew more strained, invitations less frequent. My phone remained silent more often than not, and when I did receive calls, they were short and perfunctory. The warmth of family gatherings was replaced by an icy formality, a polite distance that made my presence feel like an intrusion. I began to understand that the exclusion was not accidental, but a deliberate strategy to push me out, to rewrite my place in the story of our family. The community center, once a refuge, became a reminder of my liminal existence. I found myself navigating spaces filled with familiar faces who smiled politely but avoided deep connection. The dance hall echoed with memories, but the new rhythms were harsher, the laughter less forgiving. The second escalation was not a single moment, but a series of small, relentless acts that chipped away at my confidence and resolve. Invitations to social events arrived late or not at all. Friends who had once shared coffee and stories now made excuses. The sting of invisibility was sharper than before, because it was layered with the memory of what I had reclaimed and what was slipping away again. Yet amid the growing pressure, I found unexpected allies. A neighbor named Helen, a woman with silver hair and eyes that held both kindness and fire, reached out one afternoon after a community meeting. "I saw what you did at the dance," she said quietly, "and I want you to know you're not alone." Her words were a balm to my weary spirit, a reminder that resistance could take many forms, and that solidarity could be found even in unexpected places. Helen became a companion in the quiet rebellion, someone who understood the pain of being marginalized and the strength it took to stand tall despite it. The relationship with my granddaughter became a fragile dance of its own, moments of tension punctuated by fleeting glimpses of the girl I once knew. There were days when she avoided me entirely, retreating into the safe confines of her friends and their judgment. But sometimes, in rare moments when the laughter died down and the room grew quiet, I caught a flicker of something else, a hesitation, a shadow of guilt or regret. Those moments were brief and often swallowed by the louder voices around her, but they reminded me that the bonds of family are complex and never fully broken, even when frayed. One particularly painful day, I received a message from my granddaughter's mother. The tone was cautious, almost diplomatic. She spoke of concerns for my health and well-being, of the need to find common ground and move forward for the sake of the family. The words felt hollow, more a formality than a genuine olive branch. It was clear that the family's priority was control, maintaining appearances, and preserving their carefully constructed image. I read the message over and over, feeling the weight of its polite distance, the unspoken conditions wrapped beneath the surface. Despite the mounting pressures, I refused to retreat completely. I attended local events, walked the neighborhood with my cane as a steady companion, and sought out moments of quiet joy wherever I could find them. The memory of the dance, of the music and the lightness I had reclaimed for a brief moment, fueled my determination. I learned to carry the sting of rejection with grace, to let the whispered judgments fall like rain upon a garden that refused to wither. The second escalation tested my resolve in ways I had never imagined, but it also revealed the depth of my own strength. In the quiet evenings, I wrote letters I never sent, pouring out my feelings onto paper in a way I could not voice aloud. I traced the arc of my journey from invisibility to assertion, from humiliation to resilience. Each word was a step, each sentence a small victory. These letters became my secret companion, a testament to the woman I was becoming, despite the world's attempts to diminish me. The second escalation was a crucible, a fire that forged new steel within me. It was a time of confrontation not only with others but with myself, my fears, my doubts, and my enduring hope. I came to understand that dignity was not something granted by others, but something fiercely claimed and fiercely defended. The dance floor was no longer just a place to reclaim my steps, but a symbol of my right to exist fully and proudly, no matter the obstacles. As the weeks turned into months, the tension within the family remained unresolved, but I found peace in smaller victories, the smile of a stranger who recognized my courage, the warmth of a new friendship, the quiet moments of solitude where I could breathe and simply be. The second escalation had tested me, pushed me to the edge, but it had not broken me. Instead, it revealed the depth of my own resilience and the unyielding strength of a woman who refused to be silenced or erased. And so I continued, step by step, dance by dance, writing my own story with every movement, every breath, every quiet act of defiance. The second escalation was not the end, but a fierce, necessary chapter in a journey that was still unfolding, a journey toward freedom, dignity, and the reclamation of a life worth living. They called me a joke, a spectacle, a forgotten relic with a limp that supposedly made me less than whole. But that night on the dance floor, I decided I would no longer be a footnote in their story. The evening was thick with expectation and tension as I stepped into the community center once again, my hands steady despite the ache that whispered through my hip and down my leg. The air smelled faintly of old perfume and waxed floors, the chatter buzzing like distant thunder, but my focus was clear, sharpened by months of silent endurance and small victories. I was here not to ask for forgiveness or acceptance, but to claim what was mine by right, the dignity that no laughter, no mockery could take from me. The room was filled with familiar faces, some welcoming, others guarded, but all aware that something was different about this night. I spotted my granddaughter, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and defiance as she whispered to her friends, Their laughter was hushed but still edged with disbelief and a hint of malice, as if they awaited a fall or a misstep. The young man who had danced with me before stood at the edge of the floor, his gaze flickering with uncertainty, but an unmistakable respect. I took a slow breath, feeling the rhythm of the music pulse beneath my feet, and then I moved. I approached him deliberately, my steps measured but confident, the limp still present but no longer a limitation. I extended my hand and said softly, "Dance with me, unless you're too afraid." The room fell silent, the usual background noise fading as all eyes turned toward us. The young man hesitated briefly, then took my hand, and together we began to move. The music was slow, a classic tune that wrapped around us like a warm blanket, inviting us to a dance that was as much about reclaiming my voice as it was about the steps. With every movement, I felt the years peel away, the years of being sidelined, mocked, and dismissed. The limp did not vanish, but it became a part of the dance's story, a symbol of survival and strength rather than weakness. The young man's steps mirrored mine, uncertain at first, but growing steadier with each turn, and I felt a surge of pride that this simple act of grace could quiet the room. The laughter that had once filled the air was replaced by a hush, a collective breath, held in awe and perhaps for some, a moment of reckoning. As we danced, I caught glimpses of faces softened by surprise, even admiration. The girls who had once mocked me now looked away, their smiles faltering, their confidence shaken by the undeniable presence I commanded. The young man leaned in and whispered, "You're amazing," and those words were a balm to a wound I thought had long festered beyond healing. I smiled, not just for him but for myself, for the woman who had dared to take the floor and dance despite the world telling her she shouldn't. When the song ended, I kissed the young man's cheek lightly, a gesture of gratitude and quiet triumph, then stepped away from the floor. The applause that followed was soft but sincere, a sound I had not expected, and one that filled me with a warmth that rivaled the sting of past wounds. I did not look back at my granddaughter or her friends. I did not seek their approval or forgiveness. I had danced for myself, and that was enough. Later, as I sat alone with a cup of lukewarm punch, the night settling around me like a familiar quilt, I felt a peace that had eluded me for so long. The dance was not just a moment. It was a turning point, a declaration that I would no longer be defined by others' perceptions or their cruelty. I was still here, still whole, still worthy of joy and respect. That night, I understood that reclaiming dignity is not about erasing the past but embracing it, wearing every scar and limp as a testament to the journey. I had taken the floor, and in doing so, had taken back my life. And to any woman who finds herself sidelined or mocked, I say this: do not wait to be invited. Take the floor, even if you limp, especially if you limp, because your dance is your voice, and it deserves to be heard. The night after I danced, the world outside seemed quieter, almost as if it too was taking a moment to breathe and reflect on what had just happened. I returned to my small apartment, the walls familiar and comforting in their silence, but my heart carried a lightness that was new, unfamiliar, yet deeply welcome. The limp remained, a part of me as much as the memories of laughter and tears, but it no longer defined my worth or my place in the world. I sat by the window, watching the shadows stretch and fold over the quiet street, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace that wasn't born from resignation but from quiet triumph. In the days that followed, the sting of mockery faded into a distant echo, replaced by the steady pulse of renewal. I began to walk with more purpose, not just physically but emotionally, stepping into spaces where I once hesitated, reclaiming corners of my life that had been ceded to fear and silence. My granddaughter's laughter no longer haunted my thoughts. Instead, I found comfort in small acts of kindness from unexpected places: a neighbor's smile, a friendly greeting at the market, the gentle nod of a fellow walker in the park. These gestures reminded me that dignity is not a gift reserved for the young or the strong, but a right that belongs to every person who chooses to stand tall despite the weight they carry. The relationship with my granddaughter remained complicated, a fragile thread stretched thin by years of unspoken hurts and misunderstandings. We did not speak often, and when we did, the words were careful and measured, but beneath the surface, a quiet respect began to grow. She no longer laughed at my limp in front of her friends, and I sensed a hesitation in her eyes, a recognition that the woman before her was not the fragile figure she once mocked, but someone who had found strength in vulnerability and grace in perseverance. I learned to embrace the new rhythms of my life, finding joy in moments that once passed unnoticed. The soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the rich aroma of coffee shared with a friend. I returned to the dance floor not to prove anything to others, but to celebrate the woman I had become, each step a testament to resilience and self-love. The community center's events became less about belonging to a group and more about honoring my own journey, a space where I could move freely and without apology. One afternoon, as I walked through the park, a young mother stopped me, her eyes bright with curiosity and warmth. She spoke of her own struggles with aging parents, the delicate dance of care and independence, and the fears of invisibility that sometimes shadowed her days. We talked for a while, sharing stories that bridged generations, and in that exchange, I realized that my journey was not just my own but part of a larger tapestry of women who had walked similar paths. The dance I had taken on that floor was a symbol not just for me but for all of us, an invitation to claim our space, to be seen and heard on our own terms. As the seasons turned, I found myself less bound by the past and more open to the possibilities of the future. The limp remained, a reminder of the battles fought and won, but it no longer whispered doubt or limitation. Instead, it sang of survival and the beauty of imperfection. I wore it like a badge of honor, a mark of a life fully lived, with all its joys and sorrows. To any woman who feels unseen, unheard, or diminished, I offer this truth. Your story matters, your voice deserves to be heard, and your dance is a powerful act of reclaiming yourself. Do not wait for permission or approval. Take the floor boldly with all your wounds and strengths, and let your steps be the song that tells the world you are still here, still whole, and still worthy of joy. And as I close this chapter of my life story, I do so with a heart full of gratitude, for the pain that taught me resilience, for the laughter that sharpened my courage, and for the dance that reminded me who I am. I am not just a grandmother with a limp. I am a woman who walked through fire and found her own light. And that light will never be dimmed again.